first one was called the StarTAC. And then the Razor came along, but they had the coolest, lowest priced, highest quality phones, and I would say they still have the lowest priced, highest quality phones, and nobody cares. And why is that? They are engineers. Motorola is an engineering company. They invented Six Sigma, pretty much. They have relentlessly focused on the manufacturing process, driven down cost, kept quality at a very high level, and nobody cares. Why is that? I think it's because products now take on a life that is more than just what a single manufacturer or a single company provides. They create a whole ecosystem around them. Witness, okay, we were all using StarTACs 10, 12 years ago. We loved them. They were cool. They were small. And then along comes this company from Finland, and never heard of them before. They don't make mobile phones. We don't need to pay any attention to them. They used to make wire and cable and things like even rubber boots, for heaven's sake. So who are they? Well, by what? The early 2000s, everybody certainly in college and high school, college, you wouldn't pull anything out of your purse or off of your belt that wasn't a stylish, jewel-colored Nokia, right? And then along comes this Canadian company. And Motorola knew who that company was because that company made paging systems, but who the heck are they? We don't have to worry about them. And that company came up with the brilliant idea of combining a cell phone with email. And by what? By 2003, 2004, every business executive in the world wanted to have a BlackBerry. And then comes the coup de grace, a company that hadn't really been making cell phones at all, but they were pretty good at electronics generally, and they came up with something that now everybody wants, or everybody wants something that is so close to it you can fool your friends into thinking that it is one. And that's Apple, iPhone. So what happened? Motorola right now, their plan apparently is to make as many low-cost phones and put somebody else's operating system on there and unload them at any price this holiday season, and then probably exit the business. They've not said that, but where else are they going to go? They are caught in what economists call a grim race to the bottom. They cannot differentiate themselves except for price. And if price was all we wanted, has anyone heard of Maslow?
Yeah.
Is this true? We always say, oh, I want the best price, I want the best price. I think what we mean is we want a good price. I don't want to pay an exorbitant amount of money, but I want a lot of other things. And how many basic pair of sneakers cost about 20 bucks or less? How many people in their closet have a $100 pair of sneakers? How many people own a car that costs more than about $16,000? And you all have good reasons for doing it. So we buy on price when there is no other differentiator. But when there is a differentiator, we're very interested in that. We pay a lot of attention to that. We'll pay more for that. And what I am convinced, and I'm just parroting other smarter people, is that this is the future now. It is not low cost, high quality. Those are givens. We expect that. But also remember, when Nokia came out, their phones were a little bit more expensive and they had some quality problems. When BlackBerry came out, I remember, because I was responsible for installing that whole deal for my company at the time, and they definitely had some quality problems, and they definitely cost more. And did anyone care? No, not really. And now Apple certainly costs more, and they have some issues, and nobody cares, because the other features are so compelling. I was, for 6 years, the CIO of a company that delivered, among other things, all the paper cups to all the Starbucks stores in the country, in the United States. And we sold a very humble commodity line of products known as food service disposables, like paper cups and the little brown napkins and the swizzle sticks and stuff, and janitorial supplies, mops, brooms, buckets, floor wax, Windex. How could we possibly differentiate ourselves? And here's now where IT and business come together. 100 years ago, when Taylor made his big impact, manufacturing was the profit-generating aspect of most companies. That's what they did to earn their money. I would say now that you could, if you use IT correctly, IT is what we do to earn money. And let me expand on that a little bit. We were a cooperative. That meant that there were about 86 member companies who were all owners of the company. Those weren't branch offices. So I couldn't call them up and order them to do anything because they were my boss. They were the owners. And because we were a cooperative, we couldn't take that efficiency-focused approach to business. We had higher cost of operations because the member companies competed with each other on a local basis, and then they collaborated on national accounts. Starbucks was obviously one of our bigger national accounts. So where our competitors would eliminate all the duplicate facilities in a certain area, standardize on a single system, really go for that efficiency ruthlessly, we couldn't do that because they were all independent businesses and they didn't have to pay any attention to us. So if we cannot compete on price, then how do we survive? How do we sell new business? How do we make a profit? Good question, right? This is where we all come in. This is where you, and I don't remember who said this. I think it was Jack Welch, but I couldn't find it. Anyway, somebody smart said, never sell a commodity, never sell a naked commodity, because there's no differentiator. All there is price, and then all people will focus on is the price. So we sold paper cups to Starbucks for 2% more than the market price. How do we do that? It wasn't that Starbucks was unaware of what price the paper cups was. It wasn't that they couldn't buy in bulk. It wasn't that they couldn't go directly to the manufacturer. So why did they pay us that extra 2%? And on the cleaning supplies, we got sometimes up to 4% more, and some of the new green cleaning supplies, we got even more than that. Well, why was that? What we learned was that if you surround the paper cup or any commodity with a blanket of value-added services, you now are in a situation where you differentiate yourself and you make your product more valuable. And what starts to happen is IT becomes the profit generator in the business. Now, I worked for a bunch of guys that basically were truck drivers, warehouse workers, and then folks that went, schlepped around and sold that stuff. So when I first started advancing some of these notions, I got some pretty puzzled looks, and people thought that maybe I was just blowing smoke. But what we started to learn was, number one, every company, every organization that you guys work for, you make something that's mission critical to somebody. So first of all, find out who those customers are. People will not pay extra for something that's not mission critical. I, for whatever reason, am not that crazy about cars, so actually I do own a beat up old car that only cost about $18,000, but that's just me. A lot of you people care about what you drive and you take a lot of joy and everything else, and you will pay more for it. So if you find the people who care about your product, where your product is mission critical, and then you start to find out, well, how do they use it? What is it that makes that product so valuable to their business? And this is where I started again. I thought, what a great combination. Let's mix up IT and sales, right? I'm sure all of you guys have thought, I got to partner up with my sales guys, right? Just kidding. But it's not as crazy as it sounds, because you start going out on sales calls with these guys and you become the fly on the wall. You take notes, you listen to what's going on, and the back and forth is usually whoever the sales guy is calling on is giving the guy a whole big, a whole lot of SHIT and beating him up on price, and the sales guy is trying not to offend him, and there he is taking, punches left and right. But you start to hear what do they like about the product, what don't they like about the product, and then you find out a little bit about their business model. Now, all those things can be addressed in some way with creative use of information. And with Starbucks, it came down to things like, well, beginning, we would deliver great big sleeves of paper cups. Now, you go to a Starbucks store, they don't have a lot of storage. They store everything typically or maybe back, in some cabinets right underneath the espresso machines, but they don't have a lot of room. So the first thing we did was we worked with the manufacturer and came up with shorter boxes. Well, not so much, but then we added that to the shorter boxes. We put on special labels because they have a fair amount of turnover in the baristas, and we made all of our products very clearly labeled, easy to store. Then we started doing things like, well, how do you, once you've used the product, how do you pay for it? We found out, well, they use this certain accounts payable system, and initially, of course, we were just sending them every couple of weeks a great big invoice, and as we began to find out more about what they do, we started to, number one, we formatted the invoice to fit the accounts payable system that they were using, and then we took it the next step and we pre-processed the invoices and put in all of the accounts payable general ledger codes, because there's a different code for the paper cups, another code for the cleaning supplies, etc., etc. So we made it so that for the most part, our invoices would just go straight through. They didn't have to do anything to them. And so now we're cutting down their total cost of use. We found out some other things like, theoretically, of course, they would know how many cups and how many mops, brooms, and buckets were being used at every store every day, but that's theoretical, right? Everybody here works for a company that has a really great ERP system, and theoretically, everybody in the company should know everything is happening all the time. But of course, it took quite a while to get that information, and after you got the information, time had passed, anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, and maybe you couldn't act on it anymore. So what we started doing was, since we had all that information, very counterintuitive here, we made that information available to our customers. And we had a spot on our website where if you were a customer of ours, you could type in your password, and then you could see by store location, by supplier, over any time period from 24 hours to 2 years, you could get information on your usage. And of course, Starbucks regularly used that in negotiating with us, because the more they bought, the lower they wanted the price to be. But at the same time, it made us all those little things, no one of which was an absolute gee whiz, gotta have it showstopper. But when you put them all together and you configure them specifically to Starbucks' business model, buying paper cups from us, even though they were paying 2% more, was clearly a good deal for them than going to somebody else who would just load the cups into a truck, drop it off at a store, and move along. And that was the beginning of a big eye-opener for me, because now it came down to, okay, Mike, you've come up with these good ideas. How are you going to get them done? And there's something interesting about a cooperative. Does anyone here work for a cooperative? So there's something interesting about how the members hate to spend their own money, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's no such thing as company money, because every quarter we would rebate back. We'd take a little bit off the top to cover our overhead, and then we'd rebate back all the money based on sales to the members. And when I wanted to do something, the members would say, let's see, take the family on a great vacation to the Bahamas, give Mike some more money to do. Now, what was that exactly that you want to do, Mike? And so, routinely, they would say no. And after I got over being frustrated and feeling like the world was against me and they didn't understand how smart I was, I started thinking, well, how can we do things a little bit quicker, a little bit simpler, a little bit faster? And that, I attribute my awakening to a lot of people saying no to me all the time. And what happened was we began to come up with ways to do things that people just didn't think could be done, and I wouldn't have thought could have been done 2 years previous. And yet it was clearly working. And for instance, Starbucks, we were serving about 5,000 stores. We were not doing Band-Aids and bubble gum. We were creating industrial strength systems that were clearly differentiating our products and doing it in a way that enabled customers, that induced customers to pay more money. And then it got to the point where, and here's the really ridiculous part about it, is the sales guys wanted me and a couple of my direct reports sometimes, if I was available, to go out with them on calls. Oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Bring the computer guys along on the call. And what they were doing was basically, we had talked about what this customer was, what products they used, what was their business model, and then remember that old commercial about, let's see if Mikey likes it. Well, they would prime me with questions or things to say, because the sales guy, again, is in a very difficult position. They can't afford to offend anyone or become unpopular with a purchasing manager. But if I said it, and people didn't like it, well then what do I know? I'm just a techie, I'm a jerk, I don't know anything. But sometimes they would wrinkle their brow and then they would say, well, what are you talking about? And then they would expand on it. And it began to, we began to have kind of a Mutt and Jeff act. So I would say the bold, seemingly stupid things, and then sometimes we'd be able to push into that and get some response. So here's this whole, now we're starting to become agile. Okay, business as usual. How many people work in companies like this? I spent most of my career, and finally reached that august position. I never did become Big Cheese. That's Chicago, it's an official title called Big Cheese. But I did become the VP of this, or maybe it was that, I forget which. But I worked long and hard to get there, and when I was there, I was damn proud of it. And the other thing, though, is that you spend so much time negotiating and you get stuck in all these rules, and you begin to realize why the rules are there is because everyone is expected to behave in ways that would make a kindergartner seem smart, but there's something about the pyramid-shaped business organization that does that to all of us. This, interestingly enough, I think is what the Agile company looks like, and also, surprisingly enough, is what Agile organization teams look like, especially when you start to talk about self-organizing teams, right? And then it surprised me, the profoundly obvious, and I'm always looking for the profoundly obvious, and sometimes I see it, and sometimes I don't, but my company's name is Network Services Company, and people thought it was a telecom company, but what it meant was it was a network of distribution companies. And the network organization structure is a very agile structure. And also, if you look at the design of software, when you look at those highly cohesive, loosely coupled objects, what do you see? Anyone? Is it a hierarchy? Or is it a network? Typically, when you look at well-designed software, you'll see highly cohesive, loosely coupled objects that collaborate together on tasks in a network org structure. So there is more than a passing resemblance between well-designed software and what I would call agile organizations. So this was, and then the fact that the company was named Network, I thought was, oh my God, should have had a V8. So since leaving Network Services, I have done some consulting with a couple of companies, and there's some very interesting observations there. One was, a bunch of ex-hippies that have learned how to sell really expensive but really good stuff. And I see there's one right down on the corner there. And another one coming from an entirely different perspective is selling, well, not really selling anything, but they are certainly not ex-hippies, and they're real rigid and focused on certain things, but they are very agile. And I don't know, some people actually was at the Agile 2009 conference in Chicago. One of the vendors gave me a little book that they were handing out to people, and surprise, surprise, it was a writer that discovered that the United States Marines had some very agile practices, and there was a correlation between their agile practices and agile practices in the development of software. As I started to look into it further, with Whole Foods, you would think, well, you know, the powerful person is the regional vice president, or, you know, probably the store manager at least. And it turns out that the whole company is organized on store teams. You familiar with every store has 6 or 7 teams. They've got a bakeries team, produce team, butcher's team, checkout team, and the store manager or the regional vice president will say, these are your objectives. Typically, they are a gross dollar amount in sales and then a profit margin that they're supposed to hit. But after that, they don't really get into telling them how to do it. They don't micromanage the teams. And actually, the CEO, very colorful, outspoken, controversial character, is one of his big things is we big shots figure out what we want to do, but we leave it to the teams to figure out how, and we get out of the way because the people 10 feet from the scene of the action know better than we do, and it is our job to help them do what we have asked them to do, but not tell them how to do it. So that was surprising, and those store teams are anywhere from 10 to 20 people. The store teams do their own hiring. You know, there is an HR function there, but it's not the typical HR function that screens out all the good people and then passes through the people that didn't say anything intelligent and thus risk insulting anyone. Instead, what they do is the teams could hire anyone they want. They could hire their whole family if they wanted, but as this guy pointed out, unless they hire good salespeople and people who know how to run a business, they won't make any money. And I asked, well, what do you mean? He said, typically about 30% of your total annual compensation comes from hitting your quarterly bonuses. And they pay bonuses on a quarterly basis, at least they did 2 years ago. I'm not sure what they're doing right now. And so in other words, it was not an annual bonus, which is more or less just a bribe to stick around, and then whatever the boss remembered in the last 2 weeks is what they based the bonus on. Instead, it is strictly, did you meet your numbers, and if you exceeded them, that's even better. So he said, as long as, you know, we're not hiring people illegally, I don't really care who they hire, because they are self-motivated to hire good people that work together well. Now, I think you've all, I guess there was also a notice here earlier about a guy at IBM, Agile, like maybe it was Scott Ambler or somebody, who said that one of the biggest things when he went around IBM and looked at effective programming teams was they liked each other and they worked together well. That was the overriding factor. So again, there's a lot of similarities. The things that we do in IT are not that different, and the analogies are actually very strong. Same thing with the Marines. They have a little bit more rigorous hiring practice, but they have this concept of mission orders. So the general or the colonel or the major will say what I want, and then they'll put it in the terms of a very specific measurable action, like clear that village. But they won't say how to do it. And then they will assign it to someone who should have the skills and the resources, but after that, they stay out of the way, and all they're there to do is provide assistance, and the commander at the scene of the action, and that commander can go all the way down to a corporal commanding a squad. So it's very much focused on self-organizing. They train and they trust. They don't say how, and their attitude is, if I have to tell you how to do it, well, you're the wrong person. I'll just get rid of you and bring in someone who does know how to do it. That's where the training and the trust comes in, and that's where I started to say, well, gee whiz, here are two widely different organizations coming to the same conclusion, and whenever I see that, I figure there's some real truth there. There's some substance that isn't just unique to a certain field of endeavor. And then, as I reflected on my own company, well, we were this network of distributors. No one would stand for any micromanaging, and some of the case studies I'll show you will talk about how I motivated people. I couldn't tell anyone, I could not give people orders, I could give people suggestions. And what started to happen was I realized it's the same process of very motivated commanders at the scene of the action, typically the owners. The companies were anywhere from about 15 million on the low end to about 300 million on the high end, but all family owned for the most part. Everyone was very focused on doing their job, making money. There was none of this. If a customer wanted something, there was none of this sending a request all the way up the chain of command and then waiting helplessly until someone gave permission or denied permission. They just did it. If they thought it was a good customer, if they thought it was a reasonable request, they just did it. And so those three examples, I think, correlate pretty nicely with self-organizing agile teams. Am I stretching the truth at all? Or you've been very, very quiet, so it's either your rapt attention or I'm boring the daylights out of you. So those are some of the things that I began to realize seem a lot of commonality, and again, commonality gives me some sense that I'm on to something that's more than just trivial. As I tried to come up with an overall conceptual understanding of what are the self-organizing dynamics of an agile organization, whether it's an agile development team, whether it's that store down there on the corner, that Whole Foods store down there on the corner. There seem to be these three loops, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on these loops. But the first thing is that there is, loop number one is the awareness loop. And it's looking out over whatever environment, whatever market it is that you operate in, and figuring out the what. And then there are two other loops. And those two other loops are activated specifically by noticing exceptions to the standard. And I'm always surprised. I do a fair amount of work with supply chains, and people are always talking about, oh my God, what are we going to do with all this RFID data? My answer is, drop it on the floor. Unless it tells you something you didn't expect. But if all it's saying is, yep, the truck is there just where I thought it was going to be, pay no attention to it. As a matter of fact, do not have human beings do routine things. Have computers do that, because computers do that. And they never get bored and they scale up nicely. Only pay attention to the exceptions. So what that means is whenever your standard operating procedures show you something you didn't expect, then pay a lot of attention. And here's something that goes against our grain, I think, is don't have computers pay attention to it. Artificial intelligence is fascinating. And in business, artificial intelligence has a place sometimes. But in most businesses, it's better to have real intelligence, like between our two ears intelligence. What systems should be doing is simply point out the fact that this is unexpected. So standard operating procedures, we had systems that they started to get kind of complex, and then we scaled them back and we said, let's only deal with what happens most of the time. Let's have systems that handle what happens most of the time and do it really well. And then, well, what about this and what about that? What about the every other Sunday or in a leap year? I mean, how many times have you come up with a great system design, and there you are, you're really pleased, you've done a lot of thinking about it, and you're explaining it, and then someone in the back of the room raises their hand, you have that sinking feeling in your stomach, because you know that this is not a comment that is meant to enlighten or help. This is a comment that is meant to torpedo and sabotage, right? And then that person will inevitably say, well, what does your system do? And then they'll describe that thing that happens every other leap year, right? And then you'll go, oh no, it doesn't. And then there's a collective oh that ripples through the room, and then you shuffle off the stage and you go back to your desk and you work away and you come up with something. But in solving that problem, what have you done? Complexity. And then the next person will ask the next silly question about once every blue moon, does your system do that? And of course it doesn't do that. So what are we incurring here? I would say this is also a form of technical debt, yes? And now what we're starting to do is we're losing track of the things that really count. We're loading complexity on there. Some of the finest vendors of some of the finest and most expensive and most complex software make a living doing this, right? Nothing against that. I wish I could figure out how to do that myself. But what you get now is something that is so difficult that it begins to lose its value proposition. And if instead all you do, which is what we started to do, because again, the member companies every time it asked for money would say, well, typically no, Mike. No. What part of no don't you understand? And so what we did was we would do the basic things really well, and when there was something that did not fit a basic pattern, all the system did was alert somebody who is pre-programmed as the person who should know when this thing doesn't work. And then we would put human beings on the problem, and tell me if I'm wrong because I am prone to these oversimplifications, but there's only two reasons why you would get a non-standard input or an error. And the first one is that the system itself or the process isn't working, or it's reporting bad data because it's not working. And the second thing is because something brand new that I had never expected, never seen before, has appeared, so how could I possibly have some predefined response to that? So loop number two, and I use the analogy, I use some icons here. Loop number two I represented as a sunflower. And it is basically fix the underlying cause of the problem, continuously improve that process to make adjustments as the world changes, and you will get greater efficiencies. Loop number three is when it's something entirely new. I've never seen it before, and that's the leaping panther. That's the part that we all focus on because it's the cool and the fun stuff. That's the agile part. Now, I would say that I'm using the word responsive now because a responsive organization has an awareness of its environment, and it's able to either improve existing operations or create new operations, so it has the right balance of responsiveness and agility. Let's go into a little bit more detail, and call me if I'm just making some really gross simplifications here. Loop one is this. Now, there's a guy named John Boyd. He's died. He died about 10 years ago. But John Boyd, fighter pilot. Anyone ever heard of him? He has he came up with this decision-making process called Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. OODA loops. If you do a Google search on OODA loops, you'll get a whole bunch of hits. And basically, he started to think about what it was that made certain fighter pilots better than others. And he flew a jet fighter plane in the Korean War. And in the Korean War, for whatever reason, the Americans, and it wasn't because we were that much better pilots, but there was a 10-to-1 kill ratio between the American pilots and the North Vietnamese, or the North Koreans and the Russians. And why was that? Well, what he started to do was he began to look at, and the fact also was that the fighter planes that the Americans used were slower. They did not go as fast, they did not climb as fast, and they did not have the same level of armament on them. So why was there such an outrageous lopsided victory rate on the side of the Americans? And the Americans all said, well, it's because we're just such damn good pilots and that's all there is to it. And he started to look into it a little bit more, and what he found was that the American Sabre jet had hydraulic controls in it, and the MiG did not, which meant that American pilots could throw their jets into all sorts of insane maneuvers very quickly, whereas the North Korean pilots literally were working out with weights because they had to wrestle their planes, and the faster those planes went, the harder it was to get the control surfaces to move. So without those little advantages in maneuverability, what was going on was the American pilots were going through one maneuver after another until finally the North Koreans were just at a loss as to what to do next, and the Americans would usually win those engagements. Unless they were just quick and fast, the Americans would win. So when you look at business now, and he came up with this notion here of you observe what's going on. The most important thing is to orient what's happening. And in business, you can certainly imagine that a lot of what we hear about business intelligence is really groping to say, if everyone can see what's going on, then we can react quickly. And if we can't see what's going on, we can't react very quickly. He also, I'm using heavy lines and lighter lines. This is not a lockstep. This is not like a four-step dance. You always do all four steps. Think of it instead as a network with Orient as the center of your network, and the heavy lines are what you do most of the time. Because most of the time, you're dealing with a situation that you've seen before, and you've got an immediate response to it. If you see something brand new, then you have to go through a decision cycle. And what Boyd was saying was, the more times you can do something unexpected to your opponent and force them into a decision cycle, the slower their OODA loop cycle time becomes, and eventually you are operating at a faster pace and you have the initiative because you're forcing your opponent to always think about what the heck you're going to do next. So it seemed to be a pretty good analogy for Loop 1. Loop 2, Six Sigma. How many people here have been through any kind of Six Sigma training? And there's something they call DMAIC, which is what this is. It's just the first letter of each of the steps. And that is a fairly well codified sequence of steps. You always go through all these steps. You do not cut out any of those steps. And the point there is that it's all a heavy line too. I believe that most of the time that this is what companies need to be doing now. We've had a lot of lip service to it, but I think especially in times like now, people will tend to say, as we often do in the programming world, I'm too busy, I don't have time for quality, I don't have time to get this right. And it's one thing to rationally incur technical debt, it's another thing to unintentionally incur technical debt and then find yourself in a bind. But I also think that this process has been misused as a creative process. I don't think there's anything particularly creative about it, nor should there be, because it is meant to improve existing procedures. So there's something very analytic, there's something very focused and sequential about it, and those are the conditions where it works best. Motorola really codified a lot of this stuff, and they're engineers, and they do it very well. And here is the what I am calling agility. This is the do something new. And in my endless quest for coming up with the profoundly obvious, the merely clever, all I need is an advanced degree, and I have one. But the profoundly obvious is the really useful stuff, and it takes a while. And in trying to explain to people what it was that we were going to do, especially if we were going to do it quickly, you have to make it simple without being so simple that it's just stupid. And so when I think about it, there's only three things that you ever need to do when it comes to creating a new system, whether it's a software system, whether it's a workflow, any kind of system. And I would say that is define what you're going to do, design how you're going to do it, and then do it, as in build it. So define it, design it, and build it. And I'll, in my tutorial on Thursday, I'll get into a little bit more about specifically each of those steps. But the point there is, this is an agile process. And because it's simple, because each step has some fairly well-defined deliverables that I list there, it's something that you could literally fall out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, out of a deep sleep, and know what to do. And certainly, well-trained organizations, firemen, medics, the Marines, they train, so they can literally fall out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a chaotic situation and know what to do. So that is what when I started to institute Agile in my IT organization, this is what I drilled people on, is define, design, build. When you look at the artifacts that are delivered in each of those 3 steps, I don't think there's anything there that is radical. We've all seen that before. And then I time box the heck out of it, and these are the disciplines that we Agilists live by. So if I put them all together, this is the process flow of an Agile organization, yes? Conceptually. And now we'll go into how would I apply that, how have I applied that. And the dark lines are the things you do the most. I have been accused of making people work too hard in my zeal for Agile development, and although I live for my work, apparently there are people that do not live for their work, and I've had to admit that they have a point, and that there actually is more to life than that. So I'm very adamant that the more measured, stately, Six Sigma approach, that's something that should be going on all the time. And I don't want burnout. You can't get burned out in a Six Sigma quality control, because then you'll start making mistakes. I think that Agile works very well when you do it in bursts, and then you back off for a little while so people can keep a balance in their life. This is something I met Jim Highsmith at the last the Agile conference in Chicago, and we exchanged books, and he was very kind after reading my book, and he said, because I feel out of this trade between responsiveness and efficiency, and one of my pet sayings is, in times like now, responsiveness trumps efficiency, because efficiency depends on stability and predictability, which is conspicuously absent, and companies that are forever trying to become more responsive are like cars that go real fast as long as the road is flat and straight. But as soon as you get into the mountains and the road starts to curve and go up and down, efficient cars that go real fast in a straight line are a good way to kill yourself. So cars that go a little bit slower but are very responsive are going to be much more valuable. And then surprise, surprise, that turns out to be what this character John Boyd found out about. Jets that go a little bit slower but turn on a dime and do things much more quickly. So what he said was, Agile works best in companies where the dominant philosophy is responsiveness. And I think that is something that a lot of you, I certainly have struggled with that one, because I worked in a company where the dominant philosophy, understandably, was efficiency. We were selling commodity products at pretty tight margins, and people were interested in, eliminating headcount, and they were interested in a truck that could, drive 5 miles an hour faster because you could make your rounds faster as long as you didn't run into a traffic jam, things like that. We spent a lot of time doing studies to become more efficient, but then the world would change and our efficiencies would be for naught because we were efficient at something that wasn't important anymore. So what Jim Highsmith said was that think about the company you're in. And before you get too frustrated, think about what is the dominant philosophy of senior management in your company, because if they're focused in that Frederick Taylor efficiency mindset, then don't be disappointed if they will never let you go beyond a tactical implementation of agility. If you are working for a company that seems to be on the verge of or has figured it out in some way, that responsiveness is where they want to be. And I hark back to the difference between Motorola and Nokia, and then Research in Motion, and then Apple. I mean, those are responsive organizations. Motorola has adhered to the efficiency model, and it has not done them a whole lot of good. So, and he also points out that in an IT organization, it's a transition to go into the Agile world. And how many people here work in companies where your colleagues are still not entirely convinced that this Agile thing is all that great? Okay, so that's a transition. Now let's talk about a transformation. Okay, good. It's going to take a while. But the good news is we're under a lot of economic pressure. And without that pressure, we would never make these transitions. So I think there's hope for us all. Real world examples. 6 key principles. Another one of my pet phrases is the robust 80% solution. I use that all the time because a lot of times people are saying, well, what do you mean? In this first iteration, this first version, it's not going to do this or that? And I go, well, is that really part of the most pressing needs that you have? And when people say, well, we need to analyze this thing for 2 or 3 or 4 months, I go, yeah, but remember, a little bit of analysis can predict a short-term future. A lot of analysis cannot predict the long-term future. Therefore, why do a lot of analysis? And then you start to kind of flip into people suspect that you're somehow cutting corners and building shoddy buildings. And I keep referring to the robust 80% solution. And people seem to get that. And I say, and furthermore, you business folks, you know what you need right now because it's whatever is bothering you, whatever keeps you up, whatever you think of the first thing you walk in the door this morning. You could probably tell me in about 20 minutes, and I could feed some stuff back to you and we could get going. And then the whole thing of think big, start small, deliver quickly, which is a cool phrase. I wish I had invented it, but I heard it at a trade show about 10 years ago and can't find the guy who said it, but it's a great summation. So this first thing here, this was Starbucks. Starbucks started, and a lot of companies now are building in these very demanding service level agreements, SLAs, into their contracts, and they want all of this stuff and they want it measured, and that's part of your whole ability to get the contract. And in distribution, are there any people in distribution, humble business, if there ever was one here? Okay, good. Because it's really boring business. It's sort of like baseball, but what it means is that you have to do everything just right or you can never win the game, but there aren't that many moves in the game. It's kind of interesting in its own way. And one of the things that people use in distribution is the perfect order rate. And that means you received the order from the customer correctly, you filled the order correctly, you delivered it on time and complete, and then you invoiced it correctly. And if you do all those things, you get 100. And you say, oh, how hard is that? But an error anywhere in those 4 steps, and so the probability is multiplicative. So it's very hard, actually, to get your perfect order rate up above about 85%. It's really hard. And what we found out was one of the biggest problems was that there was every company in our cooperative had a different part number for a blue plastic bucket made by Rubbermaid. Rubbermaid had their part number, and then the 70 and some members all had their numbers, and then Starbucks would order it, and they had their number. So, well, how hard is that? You just have these translation tables, right? And of course, I was responsible for the translation tables, but the member companies would change their part numbering schemes from time to time, and they certainly had better things to do than to tell me about it. They'd get around to it eventually, but in the meantime, we were having translation problems. So we would fill the order correctly, or not fill the order correctly, we would bill it incorrectly, a lot of problems, a lot of complaining coming from the customer. We need that improved. So, thought here. First case study. How would you handle this? If part number translations are a major source of error that denies us the ability to move our perfect order rate up into the 90s and beyond, what would you do? Yeah?
Get rid of the translation.
Yes. And how would you do that? Speak up.
Use the relevant label.
Okay, one idea. Any other thoughts?
Universal product code.
Yes, UPC codes. That's part of the answer. What we thought was, well, let's all standardize on one number. You standardize on the customer's number. Oh, but there are many customers. So, UPC codes, now known as EPC, electronic part codes, but same thing. Oh yeah, well let's all standardize on UPC codes or EPC codes. And there was a lot of, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And then people thought about it and they said, wait a minute. Number one, all of our systems and our workflows have embedded our own unique part numbers in them. Our employees, bless their souls, have in many cases memorized hundreds of these numbers, which is mind-boggling to me, but they have. And so there are various reasons, and then the fact that they're all independent businesses and they don't want me to tell them what to do. The idea of anyone telling them to standardize on a single number was a political non-starter. So to your point about how do we get rid of these translation codes? All right, profoundly obvious, I think an Agile solution. What if instead of this poor schmuck here being responsible to translate all of your part numbers, what if we said, we will collect UPC codes for all of you. We sold, all told, we sold about 60,000 different items. What if we will collect all of those numbers and make them available to you folks, the members, and now you guys are responsible to do a one-to-one translation. And I would tell the owners, who are not technical people, think of it like a big long spreadsheet. And the first column is your part numbers, and the second column is the UPC code. So I will handle the translation from the customer. So when the order comes into me, I will translate it into a UPC code, and then I route that number out to the member who's going to pick, pack, and ship that order. And it comes into your system with the UPC codes on it. You have a simple little routine that just says, oh, UPC code 123 is your part number ABC. And away she goes. And then when you send me the invoice, which I'll then aggregate and bundle up and deliver back to the customer, you translate your part number into the EPC code, and away we go, right? It worked pretty well. Here's something else. Everyone was relieved that they didn't have to change their own internal part numbers. And then what started to happen was we went into this massive collection of the EPC numbers because, like, a single product has one EPC code, but a case of this product has a different EPC code. So there's a lot of numbers there. And so after about 2 years of pep rallies, memos, we even had little buttons made up, EPC now, it said, and all this stuff. And so after 2 years, everyone said, yeah, we're ready to go. Let her rip, Mike. Yeah, happening. Can do, can do. And so without telling anybody, since I couldn't order anyone, and far be it for me to go on site and inspect what they've been doing, what I did was I put up a little scorecard. And all it did was it measured for every member company whenever they sent an invoice into me, and I had to translate it from whatever they put from whatever part number they were using back to the EPC. If I didn't see an EPC code on that inbound invoice, I gave them, a black mark. And even if it was the same product sent to me 100 times with the wrong number, it was 100 black marks. This then was iteratively enhanced, so as over the next 2 years, we wound up using it for the introduction of all new products. We added more features on there, but in that first holiday season of 2004, and I wrote an article which is still actually, the CIO website in Australia still has it online. So if you do a Google on the Tao of supply chains, TAO, as in Taoism, the Tao of supply chains, it will come up. There'll be a little explanation about how that happened. That's what then got me the call from the United States Marine Corps, because they had this problem of organizing a supply chain specifically of medical products between the West Coast and Iraq. So what we did there was a whole set of fairly simple things, but it was built in a very simple way, industrial strength, scaled up, iteratively enhanced. Production quality system. Now here's a company that is into the software business, and now they've gotten into the hardware business, and their hardware business has become very popular, but what do you suppose the profit margin is on hardware versus software? You're lucky to make 10%. You're lucky to make 10% on hardware. Now, this is a company a little bit south of here. They make a very popular game console, Xbox. And in 2007, in the summer of 2007, everyone knew it was no big secret that they were having quality control problems.
Red ring of death.
Pardon?
The red ring of
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And all the gamer blogs are filling up, oh, Xbox is crap, Xbox is crap. Sony was coming on strong. They wanted to dominate the market. They wanted to be number one. So the president of that division, called Home and Entertainment H&E Division, went public and said, we know we have quality control problems. We are going to make, and they made hundreds of millions of dollars available to people who had been, inconvenienced by, the 3 red lights problem. And then they said, and furthermore, by this holiday season, it will be fixed or I will resign. Now, he was going to get fired anyway. But I would say agile response, admirable too. And then in private, he called his direct reports in and said, I'm not the only one who's going to take the bullet for this one, guys. We're all going to go down. So make it happen. His enterprise architect had been reading a series of articles that I, at the time, was writing in Computer World, and I sort of tongue-in-cheek created something I called the Agility Core. And I would do these sort of tongue-in-cheek, yo, listen up, here's what we're going to do today, guys, articles. So he called me up and he said, we're interested in some of your ideas. And they had also bought some of my books, an earlier book called Building the Real-Time Enterprise. They actually bought 5,000 copies of it. And then, bless their souls, some of them read it. This guy, Robert Mesher, read it. And he said, do you have time to come out here and talk to us about this? And I said, well, I could probably be out there this afternoon. And so we talked about it, and we talked about this whole agile approach. And Microsoft is a varied and complex puzzle palace, to put it mildly. But they decided that this was an opportunity to do something. What I learned was that people typically want to be agile, especially business people, when their backs are up against the wall. And therefore, when you find people whose backs are up against the wall, who have not already basically fallen off the cliff, that's too late. But when they're right up against the wall, those people are your best customers. Those are the people we want to talk to. And then it was a very measured and organized approach. It was that define, design, build, something I called the 30-day blitz. And it was something that they had nothing to lose. So they said, do it. And now what they wanted was, they wanted to track every Xbox console by its unique serial number. They wanted to track all the components which were coming from Malaysia, China, etc., being assembled at various places and then distributed across North America and Europe. I thought, well, in Microsoft, there couldn't be the divide between the IT and the business side of the house. Was I wrong or right? No, I was wrong. there was a major estrangement between the engineers and sales guys and the software guys. The software guys were basically coming up with 10 good reasons why they needed approximately $1.3 million in about 18 months. And I decided I had nothing to lose either, and I really wanted to impress them. So here's what we did. And again, now this was an industrial strength solution for a massive global problem. And I said, I will deliver the first iteration in 30 days. It will provide tangible value, and then we can iteratively improve it as we go. Nobody believed me, but everyone said, hey, what do we have to lose? If this character is lying, we'll blow him out of here in 30 days and not pay his last bill, so what the heck? Now, another thing that this points out, which is not going to win me any points in this room initially, but think about it. Most systems, now, like every house, is 4 walls and a roof. Every building is basically 4 walls and a roof, right? Now, some buildings are more pretty, some buildings are taller, etc., but 4 walls and a roof. Is it true that there is a similar commonality about IT systems? They tend to be a back end that gets data, a great big database in the middle that stores data, and a front end that manipulates and displays data, right? Yes. And here's where people really hate it. If I use an already well understood user interface, like the spreadsheet as my user interface, and if I focus my time and my programming talent on the extract, transform, load, and then pulling the data out of that database and populating a spreadsheet, do I get things done pretty quickly? Do I create a user interface that everyone already knows how to use? If I create a front end which is a spreadsheet with a series of tabs that show you different views of the data, and some of the tabs, the macros are locked down so you can't fool with them, other of the tabs are wide open so you can do whatever you want. And it's not as if the whole system runs off of one spreadsheet. The whole system basically has one instance of that spreadsheet delivered to everybody who is using it. And when I change one of the display rules, you know, I don't even need a developer to do that. It's something that any engineer can do on their own. Well, that's what we did. And the engineers loved it. Absolutely freaking loved it. And I wrote one of my blog posts. It's called IT Agility Makes Work Fun Again. I didn't name names and I didn't reveal any secrets, but I quoted some of the emails that went out to the project team. Because I mentored the team, I didn't do it myself. I brought 2 of my associates, we mentored them through this, and then did it again. And then they said, hey, you know, we have this other thing going on in India. Oh, yeah, it'll work just fine in India, too. And what we did was stuff that delighted the business people, but ironically pissed off the IT people for reasons that we could all probably talk about at lunch. Last little piece here is for instance, and I haven't done it, I'm not revealing any secrets here, but there is a company in Chicago that makes multicolored little chocolate candies, a company called M&M Mars, and they started a new business venture about 4 years ago to basically, they called them Ethel's Lounge, and I began to notice one evening my wife and I and some friends were coming back from a movie, and we decided, instead of going to Starbucks, what else is happening? And we walked down the street, nice neighborhood, and there's this place that is selling little coffee drinks and little Godiva-like chocolates and stuff. I believe that some marketing person figured out that we could sell the same chocolate that we're getting about a 0% margin, but making it up on volume with the M&Ms, and we could get about 100% margin, but we wouldn't have the volume. But we'd make good money for however long people were into buying cute little chocolate drinks and Godiva-like chocolates. And so what if they came to you and said, you know, give you about 90 days and said, hey, we want to open a couple of stores, we're going to try out this concept, don't bet the farm on it, but, you know, make it happen, be there when we want to open. And here's your legacy system. Your infrastructure is geared to manufacturing. Other than telling them you can't do it, or that you need about $1.3 million in 18 months, what would you do? And here is what I think agility is about, and here's where IT agility drives business agility. Whoops. All right, first iteration. Here's what I'm going to start doing. There's all this new stuff now that is really, I've noticed as I talk to people, really upsetting a lot of people in our profession. Server virtualization is not very controversial anymore. But 4 years ago, server virtualization was, well, I don't know about that. That's like for research labs. We're not doing that. Now everyone's doing that. But cloud computing is upsetting to people. Open source software is upsetting to people. Software as a service. Those things are, I mean, I do remember the introduction of PC, so you can do the math. It must be at least 100 years old. But I remember at that time, guys my age telling me that big companies couldn't run on small boxes, end of story. We're going through something even more disruptive now. But integrating those technologies in an agile way, focusing on the robust 80% solution, that's our calling, yes? Or you're just scratching your head? If they say, oh, this thing is scaling up, do it again, but again, don't bet the farm, because I've noticed that this year, people aren't so interested in buying expensive little cute cups of coffee. Anyone been to Chicago lately? Michigan Avenue, there's a section called the Miracle Mile where you can spend more money than you ever thought you had on, cute shoes and stuff. And there was an Ethel's Lounge in the lobby of the Nordstrom's in the Miracle Mile on Michigan Avenue that was selling, I'm sure, doing a very good business. In February, I noticed it was no longer called an Ethel's Lounge. It looked like Joe's Coffee or something. So this proves the point, though, because business opportunities are not forever anymore. Business opportunities may open up for a quarter, a year, 2 years, and they can make your company good money. Everything about business has IT right down the middle of it. If we can't respond quickly, if we come up with complex solutions that are worth more than the business opportunity we generate in profit, well then, who the heck needs us? But if we can come up with stuff like this, then we become heroes. And we are heroes. Last little, words of wisdom from Mr. Michael Hugos. Pretty profoundly obvious. I mean, who would argue with this? But IT is what makes it happen. Without agile IT, change and agility in the business world is a non-starter. It's impossible. So I think that's our calling. What we prove in the IT world is desperately needed in the business world. Shameless plug for a couple of my books. The Business Agility book is out at the bookstore there. Microsoft bought the sponsorship of it, but my publisher guaranteed my editorial integrity, so as you've heard me for the last hour here, this is where you cannot offshore us. This is where you cannot outsource us. This is where you cannot do anything unless we are embedded in the business. This is our future. We are the profit-making capability that drives business in a world where responsiveness trumps efficiency. Thank you. And they said, we have to do better needs analysis, we have to do better quality control, we have to do better testing. Well, I know you do. But remember in college when you had that 2-hour essay test on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and at the end of 2 hours, pencils down, hand it in? So you better hit the highlights anyway. You can't write it all. And it's the same thing. And they really resented that. And then on another project, the developers really resented the fact that I wanted to use a spreadsheet as the user interface, because I think we all like to write cool user interfaces. And as somebody told me a long time ago in the green screen days, he used to say, user-friendly is program ugly. Yeah, because that's where all the errors are. And the users don't like it anyway because they have to learn it. But a spreadsheet, there's amazing things you can do with a spreadsheet, and they all know it, and that's all they wanted. And those two things, first the resistance and struggling with the constraints, embrace the constraints, because that's what guides you to the solution. And then that whole thing about, I want to exercise my artistic capability, but they didn't care about it.
Okay. Last question.
Just in between, I suppose, the answer to that one of the 80% robust sort of thing, and Martin's talked this morning about the sort of technical debt, but you would tend to be in the prudent quarter there. So to start with, and then just assume you can make it better if it does take off. And
But
it is.
you know, good, like object-oriented design, highly cohesive, loosely coupled objects. You can't go far wrong. And then a good data model, and you separate your data access layer from your user interface layer, from your business logic layer, all the while implementing them in highly cohesive, loosely coupled objects. You can't go far wrong.
Okay, thank you, Michael. The lunch will be right here, so enjoy the rest of your day.